It was a moment of pure elation. I had just finished a cabinet that I've been working on for over a month. I had spent a couple of hours installing it in this beautiful kitchen, and I was like, yes! But then I was like, no! The sliding drawers would not slide out. They were bumping into the doors. Even though I've built dozens of pieces of furniture, I've actually never built a cabinet. That was until this 90-inch sucker. My friends Andy and Jess needed a custom kitchen pantry, and I was super excited by the challenge. The cabinet has 4 custom doors, custom handles made out of maple to contrast with the walnut, 3 sliding drawers, which we'll get to later. It's made entirely of beautiful 75-year-old walnut from my buddy Andy's grandpa, and it has a secret drawer. Let's start with building the case with 75-year-old walnut. Most cabinets are made out of perfectly flat and square plywood, which is good because you're building a box. In this case, my buddy Andy wanted me to use his grandpa's 75-year-old walnut, which sounded amazing. I was picturing perfectly stacked and stickered walnut, just ready for me to bite into, but then my friend sent me this picture. I was a little scared. Alas, once I scraped off a decent amount of chicken poop and spider egg sacs, Grandpa's wood sprang back to life. Let's go pick it up. My clients, Andy and Jess, live on a beautiful farm in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, and I was pleasantly greeted by chickens upon arrival.
Hello, chickens.
After meeting their brood, saying hi to the cows, and feeding their happy little piggies, we started sorting through the wood to find the choicest lumber for the cabinet. I was much less scared of the wood when I got there. After testing the limits of my roof rack and getting my hood signed by the head chicken, I headed home to get to work. I let the wood chill in my shop for about a week before getting started in case there was any moisture left inside. My first task was being really intentional about how to get the best yield from each board because I really didn't want to waste any of Grandpa's wood in case he was the haunting type. I also wanted to have continuous grain where possible for things like the vertical stiles and panels on the doors. Milling this lumber felt a lot like cutting the fat from a delicious steak. Once I started cutting away some of the rotted parts and running the boards through my planer, I was thrilled to see the grain come to life. Remember what I said about plywood being perfectly flat and square? Well, this wood was definitely not. Most of the wood was already 3/4 inches thick, which meant I couldn't remove a bunch of stock in an attempt to flatten each board. That meant I had to make some tricky decisions to get a good end result. I decided to pair bowed boards together with straight boards to cancel things out when I glued them up. Even still, the 2 main sides weren't as flat as I'd like after the glue up, so I had to do a fair amount of handwork. I only focused on flattening the inside of each cabinet side where the shelves would attach in order to preserve as much thickness as possible. You'll notice I'm planing at a 45-degree angle here, also known as traversing the grain, which makes aggressive stock removal so much easier. At this point, the sides were slightly oversized, and I clamped them together to create identical sides when I cut them to final dimension. I didn't want to pay $200 for the long DeWalt track for my saw, so I just jointed a board and used it as a fence, and I was pleasantly surprised by the result. Since this is a relatively shallow cabinet on the bottom half, I wanted to preserve as much storage space as possible. So I cut a rabbet in the back and inset a plywood panel instead of cutting a groove and sliding the panel in. This also enabled me to screw the panel to the cabinet, which gave the case a ton of rigidity and also helped me square things up a bit. I got lucky that my parents were in town when it was time to assemble the case, because it was a bit of a beast to glue up, and this was also the first time I'd ever used my Domino DF500. I wanted to try a nifty no-think method for shelf placement that I picked up from Sedge Tool, where you just lay your shelf down where you want it and use it as a reference for the domino, and then everything lines up perfectly when you tilt the shelf back upright. There was precisely a butt ton of mortise and tenon joints that needed to come together all at once during this glue up, so I used a similar approach to my crib build where I used a heat gun to shrink the tenons. But next time I would put all the dominoes in a box and heat them all up at once, since it was a little hard to heat them when they were spread apart across the shelves. Hugo came to inspect the glue up and he approved, but mostly wanted to just hit my bench with a hammer. One thing I did before assembly that I wanted to show you was drill and tap 4 holes on the bottom shelf for leveling feet. Tapping wood allows you to use machine screws in wood, like these 1/4 20 leveling feet. And in many cases, it's better than adding threaded inserts to wood. If you don't believe me, watch this video from Woodcraft by Summon. You can get a nice tap and die set from Home Depot for a reasonable price, and you'll find so many uses for it in your shop. Like how I cut and rethreaded this stubby little handle for my drill press because the long ones always hit my fence. Your first step when tapping wood is to figure out the thread count on your screw. You can use the included thread figure outer thing, or you can just use the tap itself to see if it matches up with your screw. You can find the right undersized bit online if you search drill bit sizes for tapping holes. And I like to countersink the hole a bit after I drill it because it makes it easier to guide the tap in. You can chuck the tap in a drill or use the included ratchet if you find it easier to stay at a 90-degree angle. But honestly, don't stress too much about that unless you're building a spaceship. Once the case was assembled, I moved on to adding 3 sliding drawers. While the drawers are relatively basic, this was a part of the design process that I was really proud of because I was able to convert an annoyance from our own kitchen into a better experience for my client. The original sketch had all fixed shelves, but we have a cabinet almost exactly like this in our kitchen, and I hate how each shelf turns into an abyss. When we met in person, we did some experimenting in the space and landed on making the lower, most used shelves the sliding drawers. Years ago, when we had our first kid and I was losing my mind because we didn't have enough space, I added sliding drawers to our cabinets in our kitchen and used a design I saw from the Wood Whisperer. These drawers have 2-inch sides, and one thing I want to highlight is that I'm using my planer to cut the drawer components to width. Table saws are scarier, messier, less accurate, and I love how I can gang up boards and cut them to width all at the same time. Instead of using screws to assemble the sliding drawers like I did in our own kitchen, I wanted to experiment a bit more with my Domino. It worked out well, and I like how there's no visible hardware. Once the mortises were cut, I made a 1/4-inch groove in the drawer sides, which would accept the drawer bottom. Notice the groove extends all the way through the front and back pieces, but stops short on the sides so you don't see the groove from the front and the back. With my router still clamped in my vise, I cut a rabbet in a 3/8-inch piece of plywood that will slide into the grooves I just made. I like to sneak up on the fit to make sure it's good and snug because it adds a ton of strength to the drawer when you glue it all together. I didn't have to worry about wood movement in this case because I'm using plywood for the bottom. I just used a square to line up the guides on the cabinet sides and centered the adjoining portion of the guide on the drawer. Once everything fit nicely, I used my new trim router to chamfer all the edges so it felt comfortable to grab the drawers and pull them out, which I realized you could not do on the day I delivered this piece. No! I guess I forgot about this part in the Wood Whisperer video I watched 2 years ago.
Most European cup hinges result in a door that protrudes into the opening. That means it would be in the way of any trays. Thankfully, I found these sweet zero protrusion hinges that put the door outside of the tray's path.
Well, I didn't install zero protrusion hinges, did I, Mark? Ugh. So honestly, I was kind of reluctant to put this part in the video because I know my client's going to watch it, and I know his kids are too, and they're going to think I'm stupid. But don't judge me too hard, Andy and Jess. I'm human, just like you. And kids, all of life is a series of chances to convert your problems into opportunities. Like how I use this problem to have an interesting hook at the beginning of the video. Now, let's see how I fixed it. Okay, so why am I so sweaty? Well, it's because I fixed it. It's because I had to cut a little channel in the door. So now, they slide out. Yeah, I had to run home, get my tools, come back, and do all that work in a shed, and it was like 100 degrees out that day. Now let's go over something that went flawlessly. Making custom frame and panel doors using the Domino joiner. Now I know some people have some opinions about Festool, and to be honest, I didn't have anything green in my shop before going full-time into woodworking. I think as a hobbyist, I kind of enjoyed doing everything the hard way. But now that I'm trying to pay for daycare for 2 kids, I have to embrace tools that give me high-quality results in less time. Making custom doors was the time the Domino shined the brightest on this project. I've noticed something really interesting about the days when I use the Domino joiner. I'm happy, and when I reflect on why that might be, I find myself thinking about the progress principle. It's a book written by some smart Harvard people that studied nearly 12,000 diary entries from 238 employees across 7 companies. And they found that making progress towards a meaningful goal has the single biggest impact on positive inner work life. And when I use the Domino, I make progress toward a goal like making frame and panel doors, so much quicker than I used to. Ooh, this board was one of the best from the pile, and it was perfect for getting continuous grain across the 4 panels on the large bottom doors. It was way wider than my jointer, so I flattened one side by hand and then got it down to 3/8 of an inch with my thickness planer. It's important to undersize a solid wood panel in a frame and panel door to allow for seasonal wood movement, and it also ensures your joints can come together during glue up. I cut my panel 1/16 narrower and 1/32 shorter than the internal opening in the door. At this point in the project, I was tempted to get totally derailed and build a router table like the Swedish maker made recently. But instead, I clamped my router back in my vise and started cutting the grooves for the door panels. That worked for the rails and stiles on the small doors, but the stiles on the big doors were way too long and tippy to safely cut this way. So I made a little router base for my new trim router that enabled me to bring the tool to the workpiece and safely cut the 1/4 inch groove. By the way, my wife hates how this new tool sounds, and I have to admit it does kind of sound like a terrible dentist office. Before cutting a 1/8 rabbet that would enable the panels to float freely within the door frames, I sanded them to avoid making the panels looser than I wanted later on. I had never used this particular bearing bit before, and it was quite satisfying. Did I mention I want a router table? Before assembling the doors, I dry fitted them and chamfered the inside corners to add some visual interest. My favorite thing about woodworking is creatively solving problems, and I ran into a funny little issue where the bearing on my bevel bit lined up perfectly with the groove in the frame, so I needed to create little 1/4 inch strips to temporarily insert into the grooves to give the bearing something to ride along. It's quick work to use a chisel to square up the corners where a circular bit can't fit. And it's these little details that subconsciously tell the eye this is handmade. Next, it was time to attach the hinges to the doors and hang them on the cabinet. I was anxious about this step because I had never worked with this style of hinge before, and I was worried I wouldn't be able to get the spacing and alignment right. After practicing on some scraps, I dialed in where to drill the mortises in the stiles. I attached the hinges to the doors first, then taped some spacers to the cabinet, and just held the doors in place against the cabinet while I marked where the frame leaf should go. I was pleasantly surprised by how well everything went together, and the 3-way soft close hinges I got from McMaster Carr made it easy to fine-tune the gaps between all 4 doors. Now, custom doors aren't truly done without some custom door pulls made from 1/4 sawn maple. I love having a simple palette cleanser that kind of gives you a break from the main complex build. I had some beautiful hard maple left over from a side table I'd made a while back that enabled me to make all 4 handles from the same piece of wood. There's nothing quite like using a sharp hand plane to smooth a beautiful piece of 1/4 sawn material. I kept track of the arrangement of the pieces so I could attach them to the doors in the same orientation that they came from the wood. Keeping track of wood grain like this is another way of adding subtle but impactful aspects to a finished piece. I used a cove bit to create the channel where your fingers go in the handles. I made 2 handles from the same piece of wood at the same time to give me more material to hold onto while routing, and then cut them apart for final shaping. Funny enough, the hardest part of making these handles was sanding out the daggone burn marks the cove bit left. I attached the handles to the cabinet before final shaping because it was easier to align a rectangle than an oval. I cut the rough oval shape at my bandsaw, smoothed things at the drill press, and then made my hands go numb doing the final sanding with my palm sander. Now I love some crisp chamfers, so I used a hand plane and a chisel to add the final details after sanding. I want to show you 2 small things that have given me better results when attaching wooden components together. First, you'll notice wax on the screws I'm inserting. This makes it so much easier to drive a screw in, especially if you're using slotted screws, which are way easier to strip. Also notice how the screws are not tight in the door. After drilling pilot holes through the doors and handles, I went back and drilled slightly bigger holes in just the doors. This puts all the clamping force where it should be between the screw head and the handle. Look, Ma, hands. We made it to my favorite chapter, including a secret drawer behind the cabinet for, well, that's a secret. Just kidding, I'll show you in a second. If you like and subscribe, but you know what would really blow my mind? If you hit that super thanks button, threw me a few shekels. But in seriousness, these videos take me a lot of time, money, and energy to make, and it would mean a lot to me if you wrote me a thank you note with a president's face on it. Pause button's there. Super thanks button is there. Okay, let's resume. The most interesting part of my client's design brief is that they wanted hidden storage behind the cabinet for cleaning supplies. After some thinking, I decided a big sliding drawer would do the trick, and I built the main body of the drawer using 3/4 inch plywood. The trickiest part of the design is that I needed to create a recessed portion of the drawer that I could attach the drawer guides to without making the drawer stick out too far from the cabinet. This was one of those surprisingly stressful glue-ups because I learned that you can split plywood when you drive a domino into the end of it. Once everything dried, I cut a notch in the back of the drawer that would allow for the drawer guide to slide through. If only I had thought as much about the drawer guides in the front of the cabinet as I did in the back of the cabinet. Anyways, look how happy I was when everything lined up. The drawer was already pretty square and strong as is, but when I attached the pegboard backing, it came out perfect. To attach the drawer face, I used double stick tape to temporarily hold the wood in place while using 1/8 spacers, also taped on to create a consistent gap around the drawer. Then I pulled it out, clamped it on, and screwed the face to the drawer. To create the recessed handle, I removed the drawer face and hogged out the material at my drill press using a 45-degree scrap that I clamped the workpiece to. After removing the bulk of the material, it was pretty quick work to use a chisel to smooth things out. With a little rasping and sanding, it was ready to go. Let's take a look at the final build.